Long before the sun crested the distant snow-capped peaks, Madison Blake was awake. Montana's wild forests stretched endlessly before her, untamed, ancient, and promising secrets no city dweller could ever understand. As she zipped her weathered jacket and hoisted a battered camera bag over her shoulder, the air felt electric with possibility. The kind that pulled you out of bed before dawn and sent you chasing legends with nothing but grit and a stubborn sense of wonder. A heavy mist curled along the forest floor, swallowing the last traces of civilization behind her. Each step Madison took left a faint print in dew-soaked earth, boots damp but steady, carrying her farther from the world she knew and deeper into a place ruled by instinct and chance. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting her lungs, and every breath tasted of pine needles, damp moss, and the metallic hint of hidden rivers. Madison's heart thumped with anticipation. For months she'd studied maps, tracked migration patterns, and read weathered rancher accounts about a wild Mustang herd rumored to roam these parts, a breed as old as the American dream itself. If she could capture their spirit on film, her new photo series might be her breakthrough. Not just for her, but for the Mustangs, creatures whose freedom was as threatened as the forests themselves. As the sky lightened to a steel gray, Madison scanned for signs. She paused beside a fallen tree, running gloved fingers over a patch of disturbed earth. There, a single hoofprint, crisp and deep, pointing east. Her pulse quickened. She glanced up, scanning the shadows for movement, her breath held in the stillness. Somewhere nearby, a jay shrieked and flitted away, startled by her presence. The forest grew denser as she followed the tracks, branches reaching like bony fingers to snag at her coat and snag loose hair from her braid. Twice she slipped on the slick carpet of leaves and needles, catching herself on knotted roots. Each stumble reminded her how easily this wilderness could turn, how little it cared about ambition or plans. Still, she pressed on, the thrill of the unknown burning in her chest. Hours passed as Madison hiked deeper into the heart of Montana's wild country. The world felt ancient here, older than any road or ranch fence. She found evidence of elk and coyote, scat and fur, and sometimes the haunting echo of a wolf's distant howl, but never the Mustangs. Doubt crept in. Was this only a wild goose chase? Another empty myth? But as the sun finally pierced the canopy, sending golden rays flickering through needles and brush, Madison's perseverance was rewarded. A fresh cluster of hoofprints crossed a patch of soft mud near a narrow stream. Kneeling, she brushed away debris, studying the distinct shape. Wild Mustang, no shoes. And nearby, shreds of black hair caught on a thorny bush, so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Madison moved with greater care now, every muscle tensed, camera ready at her side. She paused by the stream, letting the babble of water cover her own movement as she scanned the thicket beyond. The Mustangs were close. She could feel it, as certain as the beat of her heart. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded in the distance, and Madison froze. Not thunder, not a branch. Something man-made, a noise that didn't belong to the wild. Her nerves prickled. She dropped to a crouch, peering between tree trunks, senses heightened. Silence, then a flock of small birds burst into the sky, startled by something out of view. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow darting through the undergrowth. She raised her camera, adjusting the lens, desperate for a glimpse. But what she saw wasn't the fluid, joyous movement of a Mustang herd. It was something else entirely, a hint of black, tangled and low, unmoving. A sense of foreboding settled over her. Against every instinct, Madison pressed forward. The landscape shifted as she crossed into a wide, overgrown clearing. The mist hung heavier here, the air strangely still. That was when she saw it. Hoofprints scattered in chaos, tufts of black hair, and, far more chilling, a drag mark in the mud, leading to a lone tree at the clearing's edge. Her stomach clenched. Something had happened here. Something violent. In that moment, Madison understood. This place wasn't just a sanctuary for the wild. It was also a stage for desperation, cruelty, and survival. The wilderness, for all its beauty, was never neutral. She took one shaky breath, steeling herself. Whatever waited beyond that tree, she had to see. She owed it to the story, to the Mustangs, and to herself. Madison Blake, alone in Montana's vastness, stepped out of the shadows and into the unknown, not knowing that every decision from this moment would change her life, and the life of a wild Mustang forever. The air in the clearing was unnaturally quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Madison's boots sank into the spongy earth, each step heavy with a mix of dread and determination. She moved slowly, every sense alert, scanning for danger and evidence alike. The drag marks in the mud became clearer, leading her gaze to the battered trunk of a tall pine. And then she saw it. A black Mustang chained tightly to the tree, its legs trembling with exhaustion, sides heaving as it struggled to breathe. The animal's coat, though caked with dirt and streaked with old blood, still shimmered in the morning light, a glossy black that stood out even in the gloom. Its mane, tangled and wild, fell over one eye, partially hiding the terror burning within. For a split second, time stopped. Photographer and subject locked eyes, one desperate, the other stunned by horror and empathy. Madison fought down a wave of nausea. The chain wrapped mercilessly around the Mustang's neck and foreleg, the iron links biting into raw, abraded skin. Flies swarmed the open wounds on its shoulders and haunches. The Mustang tried to shift away as she drew closer, but there was no escape. The more it struggled, the tighter the chain pulled. Fresh blood mixed with mud beneath its hooves, proof of a night spent in agony. It wasn't just the suffering that sickened Madison. It was the method. Someone had left this horse as bait, tethered in the wild to lure predators for sport or slaughter. Her hands curled into fists. She'd heard the stories. Kill buyers and poachers targeting wild Mustangs, branding and brutalizing them for profit, sometimes leaving them for wolves or bears as twisted entertainment. But seeing the aftermath in person, so visceral and raw, was something she could never have prepared for. Madison knelt, careful not to startle the animal further. She kept her movements slow and deliberate. Setting her camera bag aside and reaching gently into her pack for a collapsible water bottle, the Mustang flinched, eyes rolling white, but thirst overcame fear. Its cracked lips parted, and it lapped greedily at the water Madison poured into her cupped hand. She whispered soft words, not to calm it, but to steady herself, to push down the anger and heartbreak threatening to bubble over. The early sun revealed more details as it climbed. On the Mustang's left haunch, a fresh, ugly brand glared red and angry. A makeshift symbol burned into the hide. The mark of a kill buyer, unmistakable and cruel. Madison felt a cold fury take root. She snapped a few photos, not out of habit but as evidence. Proof that someone had done this. That this horse's pain had not gone unseen. She examined the surrounding area, piecing together the scene. Near the base of the tree, she found a discarded whiskey bottle. the glass smudged and reeking of stale liquor. Cigarette butts lay scattered among the pine needles, fresh enough that their scent still lingered, acrid and intrusive. Tire tracks curved out of the clearing and disappeared into the brush. Whoever had done this was gone, but maybe not for long. Madison glanced back at the Mustang, reading the fear and exhaustion in every muscle. She moved around to the animal's flank, careful to stay within its line of sight. The wounds were bad, but not hopeless. With some care, water, and time, the horse could recover, if only she could free it before predators or men returned. In that moment, a connection sparked between them, silent but fierce. She saw not just pain, but an indomitable will to survive. As she reached for her small first aid kit, her mind replayed a memory of her own, standing helpless as a young girl while her family's dog was struck by a neighbor's car, the driver never stopping to help. That feeling of powerlessness had never fully left her, but here, now, she could act. Madison pressed a damp cloth to the Mustang's wounds, rinsing away blood and dirt. She whispered a promise into the crisp morning air. She would not leave this creature behind. All around them, the forest slowly awakened. A distant woodpecker hammered against bark, and somewhere deeper in the trees, an unseen animal crashed through undergrowth. Madison worked quickly, refilling the water bottle and pressing it once more to the Mustang's lips. She studied the chain, old, rusty, but sturdy enough to hold a wild horse captive. Her pocket knife would be no match for iron. She would have to come up with something else, and soon. Overhead, the clouds thickened, casting the clearing in a dim, anxious light. Madison's nerves tingled with the sense that time was slipping away, that danger was creeping closer. But she didn't falter. The story was no longer about photographs or career ambition. It was about mercy, about defying cruelty with every small, stubborn act of kindness she could muster. The Mustang's breathing grew steadier, its eyes tracking her every move. Madison reached out, palm open, letting the horse smell her skin. In that quiet, trembling moment, she understood. This wild creature wasn't just a subject for her lens. It was a life worth saving, a spirit refusing to break, even in the darkest of circumstances. And as the first hint of wind stirred the treetops, Madison vowed to see this rescue through, no matter the cost. The wilderness had just thrown down its first real challenge, and she was ready to answer. Madison Blake knelt beside the battered Mustang, the reality of her situation pressing in from all sides. The clearing no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a crime scene, a place where cruelty had taken root. She glanced anxiously over her shoulder at the dense forest. The morning mist was thinning, but a heaviness hung in the air, an unspoken warning. She couldn't linger here, not with evidence of human trespass all around. Her eyes darted from the suffering horse to the details left behind. The whiskey bottle, its label torn and sticky with residue, glinted dully in the half-light. Nearby, cigarette butts lay half-buried in damp needles, their edges still faintly smoldering. The tire tracks leading away from the tree were fresh, deep grooves pressed into the soft ground, signs of a vehicle not long gone. Madison's pulse picked up, a primal sense of danger gnawing at her gut. Whoever did this could easily return. She moved closer to the Mustang, the chain's cruel bite into its flesh now more obvious with the blood and mud cleaned away. The brand, still raw and swollen, stood as a vicious badge of ownership, proof of the kill buyers who haunted the back roads, collecting wild horses for slaughter and profit. Madison's mind raced, cataloging every detail, filing it away for authorities, for her own records, for anyone who would one day fight to stop this horror. But the horse, above all, needed her now. She fumbled with her emergency kit, searching for bandages and ointment, anything to slow the bleeding. The Mustang, despite the pain, allowed her to work, its wide, dark eyes fixed on hers, breath hot and ragged on her wrist. It was more than trust. It was a silent plea for mercy, a glimmer of hope that maybe this time someone cared enough to help. Her hands moved quickly, guided by both instinct and desperation. She pressed a folded gauze pad against the worst of the wounds, using her body to shield the horse from the sharp edge of the wind. The chain rattled with every tremor of the Mustang's limbs. She offered more water, the bottle trembling in her grip, but the horse drank with slow, grateful sips. Madison tried to comfort the animal with soft murmurs, though she knew her words couldn't erase the trauma burned into its memory. Time felt distorted, moments stretching and collapsing as she worked. She knew she needed to move, but every minute spent here was another risk, another chance for those men, or something far worse, to return. The forest, so silent before, now seemed full of whispers, branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant footfalls that might only be squirrels or might be something else entirely. Madison forced herself to stand and survey the scene one last time. The kill buyers would likely come back, either for the horse or to collect whatever profit a predator left behind. Every scrap of evidence pointed to organized cruelty, a system that treated these animals like disposable objects. The brand on the Mustang's hide burned into Madison's mind as deeply as it had into the horse's flesh. She reached for her camera, snapping a handful of photos, not for art, but for proof. If she could get the Mustang to safety, these images might help put an end to such brutality. She crouched again, speaking quietly as she examined the chain. It was old, reddish-brown with rust, but still far stronger than anything she carried. Her camp knife would do little more than scratch the surface. Frustration bubbled up. She needed something to break the iron, or a miracle. Her eyes swept the ground, searching for anything useful, but the clearing offered only fallen branches and rocks too small to matter. A sudden noise jerked her attention to the forest's edge, a snap, sharper than any branch. Her heart pounded, adrenaline flooding her veins. Was it the kill buyers, returned to finish what they started, or a predator drawn by the scent of blood? Her mind cycled through her options, none of them good. She had a flare in her pack for emergencies, a single burst of light and fire meant for rescue. But would it be enough to save them both? She steadied herself and focused on the horse. As she reached to check the wounds again, she noticed the Mustang's trembling had eased. If only a little. Its breathing was steadier now, its eyes a little less wild. In that small moment of calm, Madison felt a surge of determination. She would not let this horse die alone in the wilderness. She would not let cruelty have the final word. She pressed her forehead to the Mustang's, feeling the warmth of its body, the steady thud of its heart. She whispered another promise, not for comfort, but as a binding vow between two survivors. She would fight for its life, even if it meant risking her own. As a distant wind rattled the branches, Madison braced herself. She would have to act soon, before darkness fell, before the men or the wild found them. With one final look at the battered clearing, Madison began to plan. She would need speed, courage, and luck. Time was running out, and in the wilds of Montana, mercy was something you had to make for yourself. The silence in the clearing began to change. Madison could feel it, an invisible ripple of unease passing through the trees, as if the forest itself was bracing for something it could not prevent. The air, already heavy with damp and tension, seemed to thicken. Every instinct in Madison's body screamed that time was almost up. Somewhere nearby, a jay let out a shrill warning and darted away. She knelt once more by the black Mustang, feeling the animal's breath slowing, but the calm was only surface deep. The horse's ears flicked and its eyes widened, nostrils flaring as if it too sensed an approaching threat. Madison glanced toward the wall of dense trees that hemmed them in. The forest was alive with sound now, twigs snapping, brush shifting, a deep, low rumble that rolled through the undergrowth and made the hairs on Madison's arms stand up. Her mind raced through possibilities. She'd grown up hiking and camping in wild country, and she recognized the sound before she saw the shapes. A pair of black bears, massive and lumbering, materialized from the gloom. Drawn by the blood and the horse's weakness, they sniffed the air, heads swinging side to side. The larger bear's fur was mottled, its eyes dark and calculating, the smaller one hovering behind like a shadow. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, noses twitching, evaluating their chances. Sun gripped Madison, her hands shaking as she instinctively reached for her camera bag. The bears, though often shy, could be dangerous when desperate, or when the smell of fresh blood hung so thick. Her options were grim. She was armed with only a pocket knife, a single flare, and a basic emergency kit. No bear spray, no firearm, nothing that would offer real protection if things went wrong. She glanced at the Mustang, chained, wounded, vulnerable. The horse let out a soft, almost apologetic whinny, pressing its trembling body closer to the tree. Madison knew that the Mustang, if left here, was doomed. She refused to let the wild finish what human cruelty had started. Her own fear was a background hum. The urgency to act was all-consuming. The bears crept closer, cautious but curious. The larger one rose on its hind legs, sniffing, its massive paws dangling like clubs. Madison's mind flashed through her training. Never run, make yourself big, stay calm. But her heart hammered a wild rhythm. She needed a plan. She needed a miracle. The animals circled, drawn by the Mustang's scent and the unmistakable tang of blood. The smaller bear uttered a guttural growl, padding forward in short, hesitant bursts. Madison inched backward, the world narrowing to the space between her, the Mustang, and the predators. The tension became a physical force, as if the very ground buzzed with it. Suddenly a cloud shifted overhead, and a beam of sunlight shot through the mist, illuminating the black Mustang like a spotlight. For a second, everything felt suspended. Madison, the horse, the bears, all held in that sliver of gold, a scene frozen in time. It lasted only a moment, but in that flash, Madison felt something stir inside her, a resolve deeper than fear. She looked into the Mustang's eyes, wide, glassy, but alive with a stubborn will to survive. Madison reached for the flare at her belt, fingers slick with sweat. She remembered every story she'd ever heard about bear encounters, every cautionary tale, every lesson learned from nature itself. The forest didn't reward panic. It rewarded those who faced fear head-on. A branch snapped under the weight of the larger bear, breaking the spell. The animal dropped to all fours and advanced. Madison's breath came shallow and fast. She knew she'd have only one shot to create enough confusion to make a move, one chance to save both herself and the Mustang. The camera bag, the emergency kit, the flare, they were all she had. The rest would be luck and courage. As the bears closed in, Madison made a split-second decision, adrenaline drowning out everything but the need to survive. She tightened her grip on the flare, eyes fixed on the shadows that flickered along the forest floor. The Mustang, sensing the shift, began to struggle anew, testing the chain with weak, desperate kicks. All around, the forest held its breath once more, the wind still. The birds silenced, every living thing waiting to see how this deadly encounter would end. Madison could feel her heart pounding in her ears, a drumbeat that urged her forward, a primal reminder that sometimes you only get one chance. In that moment, caught between the cruelty of men and the law of the wild, Madison resolved that she would not leave this clearing without a fight. The clearing pulsed with tension, every heartbeat echoing the threat lurking in the forest's shadow. Madison could sense the bears' presence closing in, the heavy sound of their paws muffled only slightly by pine needles and damp moss. She drew the emergency flare from her bag, her fingers slick with sweat, mind racing through her limited options. Her entire body vibrated with a focused panic, a state where instinct eclipsed fear and hesitation could mean disaster. The larger bear paused, rising again to its full, formidable height. The Mustang pressed closer to the tree, the chain rattling in alarm, its nostrils flared and eyes rolling white with terror. Madison knew she had no time to waste. She forced herself to breathe, to focus, to steady her trembling hands as she snapped the cap off the flare and struck it hard against the rough ignition strip. A sudden burst of angry red light erupted from the flare, crackling and sputtering, casting erratic shadows across the clearing. Madison held it high, waving it back and forth, the acrid smoke burning her nose. The bears recoiled, their instincts overriding hunger for a moment, as the unfamiliar brilliance and noise pierced the tranquil gloom. The light caught in their eyes, blinding them, driving them back into the tree line where they lingered, uncertain. Madison didn't wait to see if the flare would hold the animals at bay. She lunged for her camp knife, scrambling to the Mustang's side. The iron chain, ancient and stubborn, resisted her every effort. She sawed at the rusty links, hands shaking, sweat running down her brow, grit biting into her palms. Every second stretched on, a race against returning predators and the memory of human cruelty echoing all around them. The flare sputtered and smoked. The bears, momentarily confused, circled just out of reach, chuffing and pacing. Madison's knife finally found purchase in a weakened section of chain, her efforts fueled by desperation. The metal groaned and splintered, flakes of rust falling like bloody snow. The Mustang sensed freedom within reach. Its trembling turned to shivering, muscles coiled in anticipation. Madison braced her boot against the trunk and pulled with every ounce of strength. The chain snapped with a sharp, metallic shriek, echoing through the woods. She gasped, the sound reverberating like a gunshot, but there was no time for relief. She tossed the broken chain aside, shoving her knife into her pack, grabbing the makeshift lead rope she'd fashioned from a length of paracord. The Mustang hesitated, too weak and disoriented to immediately bolt. The bears were regrouping, emboldened by the flare's dying light. Madison locked eyes with the Mustang, a silent plea, a surge of hope. She tugged gently, urging it forward, her voice low and steady despite the panic roaring in her chest. The horse took a trembling step, then another, its weight shifting from terror to fragile trust. They moved together, stumbling from the clearing, shadow and smoke swirling in their wake. Every branch seemed to claw at them as they fled into the thicket. Madison guided the Mustang as best she could, weaving through undergrowth, heart hammering. Behind them, the bears let out a low, frustrated bellow, the flare's final spark fading into the gray morning light. Madison kept moving, forcing herself to ignore the pain in her arms and the fatigue in her legs. The forest closed in, the path barely visible, overgrown with ferns and brambles. Madison stumbled, catching herself against a mossy log, her camera bag bouncing painfully against her hip. The Mustang limped beside her, favoring its chained leg but pressing on, driven by some ancient instinct that whispered of open spaces and safety far beyond the reach of predators and men. They emerged at last onto a narrow animal trail, the air clearer here, the oppressive silence of the clearing replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds reclaiming the day. Madison dared a glance back, nothing but tangled brush and the ghosts of danger. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She slowed only when she was certain they weren't being followed, dropping to her knees in the soft earth. The Mustang stood beside her, breathing hard, sides flecked with sweat and mud. Madison reached up, stroking its tangled mane, whispering quiet reassurances more for herself than for the animal. They had survived the first trial, escaping not only the cruelty of men, but the jaws of the wild itself. But they were far from safe. The day was just beginning, and the wilderness had more tests in store. As sunlight filtered through the trees, catching the black shimmer of the Mustang's coat, Madison realized that their journey together had truly begun. Every step forward was a gamble, a fight for survival, for trust, for the chance at a new story neither of them had chosen, but both were determined to finish. The forest swallowed them whole. Madison pressed forward, one hand clutching the makeshift lead rope, the other steadying herself as she and the black Mustang fought their way deeper into the Montana wilderness. The narrow game trail twisted beneath towering pines, the ground a maze of tangled roots and rocks, slick from the morning's persistent damp. Every so often, Madison glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark forms of the bears crashing through the underbrush. But the only pursuers now were shadows and her own racing thoughts. The Mustang stumbled frequently, exhaustion and injury making every step a trial. Madison felt the animal's struggle with each tug on the rope, its breaths short and sharp, legs shaking with fatigue. But the horse refused to give in, its wild heart driving it forward. Madison's admiration deepened with every mile. Here was a creature who had survived both man's cruelty and nature's indifference, who pressed on simply because there was no other choice. The air grew colder as they ascended, pine needles crunching underfoot. The sun, which had briefly promised warmth, vanished behind a wall of rolling clouds. A restless wind rose, sighing through the trees and carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. Madison shivered, her sweat-soaked shirt clinging to her skin. She pulled her jacket tighter and urged the Mustang along, eyes searching for any sign of shelter or a safer route forward. Hours passed in a blur of motion and worry. At times, the terrain grew so steep that Madison had to lead the horse in a zigzag, both of them slipping and sliding down muddy inclines, branches whipping at their faces. Each time they faltered, Madison fought to keep her fear at bay, channeling it into a fierce determination. She would not lose the Mustang, not after all they had endured. She whispered encouragements, soft, wordless sounds meant to comfort as much as motivate. Sometimes, in the pauses between their struggles, she could almost feel the horse's trust blooming, tentative but real. As the sky darkened, a new threat emerged. The thunderstorm that had lingered on the horizon now barreled toward them, fast and furious. The first fat drops of rain splattered against Madison's face, quickly turning the trail to slippery muck. Lightning crackled above the treetops, illuminating the twisted shapes of branches and briefly painting the world in harsh white. The Mustang shied at each thunderclap, flanks quivering, eyes rolling with remembered terror. Madison tightened her grip on the rope, fighting to keep both of them moving, their pace a clumsy dance of desperation and hope. The rain became a torrent, the cold seeping through Madison's clothes and into her bones. She scanned the woods for anything that might offer protection. An overhang, a hollow, any break from the deluge. Her search was rewarded when she spotted a cluster of rocks beneath an ancient pine, their base eroded into a shallow cave. Madison coaxed the Mustang toward it, her own legs barely responding as exhaustion gnawed at her resolve. They ducked inside just as the storm broke in full fury, sheets of rain lashing the world beyond their fragile shelter. Madison collapsed onto the damp earth, pulling the Mustang close. The space was cramped, but the horse pressed against her side, sharing warmth and a sense of battered relief. Madison dug through her pack for a mylar blanket, wrapping it around the Mustang's neck and shoulders as best she could. She wiped rain from the horse's face, murmuring her gratitude for their narrow escape, for the stubborn pulse of life that kept them both moving. Outside, the storm raged, thunder booming, wind howling, the scent of ozone sharp in the air. Madison pressed her back to the cold stone, heart still racing as she listened to the Mustang's breathing slow, its body finally relaxing now that the worst was over. She tended to its wounds again, cleaning and binding where she could, using the last of her supplies with careful hands. Every scrape and bruise told the story of their flight, every scar a testament to the Mustang's spirit. Night crept in, heavy and absolute, the cave a pocket of tenuous safety amid the chaos. Madison let her eyes close, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep. The Mustang's rhythmic breathing and the storm's distant rumble became a lullaby, rough, imperfect, but proof that they had survived another day. In the quiet darkness, Madison allowed herself a rare moment of hope. The wild had tested them with everything it had: predators, pain, and now the wrath of the elements. Yet here they were, alive and together, sheltering from a world that seemed intent on breaking them. She reached out and rested her hand on the Mustang's warm flank, a silent promise that whatever storms still waited, they would face them side by side. As night draped the forest in heavy shadow, the cave became a haven for two battered souls. The storm raged on, rain pounding the earth with a wild rhythm. But inside their rocky shelter, Madison and the Mustang found a fragile peace. The horse pressed close to Madison, its powerful body trembling each time thunder cracked overhead. But with each passing hour, the sharpness of its fear began to dull. Madison drew her knees up to her chest, listening to the rain and the measured, cautious breaths of her companion. In the faint light of her headlamp, Madison studied the Mustang more closely. The animal was regal even in its misery, coat black as a moonless sky, eyes dark with exhaustion and pain. Dried blood and mud clung stubbornly to its legs. Madison's heart ached at the constellation of scars that mapped the Mustang's flanks and neck. Some wounds were fresh and ugly, the work of chain and brand, but others were older, reminders of a life shaped by hardship and survival. Each mark was a story, a history carved in silence. Gently, Madison reached for her last clean bandage and pressed it against an oozing cut near the horse's shoulder. The Mustang tensed at her touch, then, after a moment, seemed to relax. Madison's voice was low, nearly a whisper, as she offered quiet reassurances to the animal, though she knew words were more for herself than for the horse. She felt the boundaries between fear and trust begin to blur. In that tiny, stone-walled world, it was easy to forget everything else. The men with guns, the wild predators, the relentless storm outside. She pulled a piece of apple from her pocket, holding it out on an open palm. The Mustang hesitated, nostrils flaring, before finally accepting the treat with cautious lips. Madison smiled to herself, recognizing the monumental step that simple gesture represented. Bonding with a wild animal required patience, respect, and above all, gentleness. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had offered this horse a kindness with no strings attached. As the hours crept by, Madison felt exhaustion pulling at her, but sleep was elusive. Memories surfaced, unbidden and raw. She remembered her own scars, less visible but just as real, the helplessness of watching a beloved pet suffer when she was young, the frustration of trying and failing to stop a friend's abusive relationship, the cold anger that had risen in her whenever she witnessed injustice, animal or human. These moments of powerlessness had left marks on her soul, shaping her as surely as the chains and brands had shaped the Mustang. In the quiet, she whispered a promise not only to the horse but to herself. Never again would she stand by and do nothing. A new name bubbled to her lips. Shadow. It seemed fitting. This survivor who had lived so long in darkness, slipping through the world unseen and unclaimed. Madison murmured the name, feeling it settle into the space between them. The Mustang lifted its head, ears swiveling as if listening, as if it too sensed a shift in their fate. Madison allowed herself a moment to believe they might both be on the brink of something new, a partnership born not of ownership but of shared survival. The storm raged on, but inside the cave, time moved differently. Madison found herself lulled by the horse's breathing, by the steady drip of water from the rocks overhead, by the sense that for this one night, they were safe. She watched as Shadow closed her eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep. Madison stayed awake a while longer, determined to watch over her new companion, alert to every distant sound, a broken branch, a howl carried on the wind, the thunder rolling farther away. If any danger approached, she would be ready. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed. Pale light filtered through the entrance, painting silver streaks across Shadow's coat. Madison crawled from beneath her mylar blanket, every muscle aching, but with a small, stubborn hope alive inside her. She checked the bandages, refilled the water bottle, and offered another sliver of apple. Shadow took it eagerly, the fear in her eyes slowly giving way to something softer, a cautious trust, a willingness to believe in the possibility of safety. Outside, the forest was transformed. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything sharp and bright, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Madison stood at the cave's mouth, Shadow at her side, both blinking into the new day. Whatever challenges still waited, men, predators, the unknown, they would face them together, a woman and a Mustang, united by the scars of the past and the fragile bonds of hope. The morning after the storm dawned cold and bright, but the sense of relief Madison had felt in the cave soon evaporated. Sunlight sliced through the dripping branches, illuminating the aftermath of the wild night. Downed limbs, puddles that reflected the sky, and a hush that felt like the world holding its breath. Madison rose stiffly, her muscles sore and heavy, but she moved with purpose. She checked Shadow's wounds, changed the makeshift bandages, and offered water and another piece of apple. The Mustang ate, standing steadier than before, her deep eyes now flickering with cautious hope instead of panic. For a brief time, the world felt gentle. Birds returned to their perches, shaking rain from their wings and filling the air with tentative song. Madison took a few quiet moments to snap photos of Shadow, images that captured not pain, but resilience, the wild beauty of a survivor. She promised herself that if they made it out, she would use these pictures to tell the truth, not just about cruelty, but about courage. But the fragile peace was not to last. As she stepped out of the cave to scout for a path forward, a sudden unease tugged at her senses. The air was too still, the silence unnatural. She scanned the muddy ground at the cave's entrance, and her heart sank. There, pressed into the soft earth, were fresh boot prints. Not just one, but several, circling and doubling back, mingled with cigarette butts, their tips dark and wet from the rain, but new enough that their scent still lingered beneath the sharp tang of pine. Madison crouched and touched the prints. Her mind raced. The men had come looking for Shadow, likely last night, possibly just hours ago, and they might return at any moment. She felt the old, cold fear crawl up her spine, but she forced herself to think. Panic would not save them. Only action would. Returning quickly to the cave, Madison found Shadow tense, ears swiveling toward every stray sound. The horse seemed to sense the change in Madison's mood, shuffling her hooves, nostrils flaring. Madison reached into her pack and pulled out her last piece of apple, breaking it into smaller bits. She extended her palm, murmuring softly, her hand steady even as her mind spun with anxiety. Shadow took the treat, her lips brushing Madison's skin, a gesture of trust forged in fear. They needed a plan. Madison surveyed the forest, calculating her options. The terrain around the cave was steep and cluttered, difficult for men to navigate quietly but dangerous if they had weapons. The main road, according to her map, was miles away, and the river they'd crossed the previous day was now swollen from the storm. But staying put meant waiting to be found. The only hope was to move, quietly, carefully, with every sense alert. Before leaving, Madison erased what signs she could of their stay, covering their tracks near the cave with branches, scattering the remains of their small camp, wiping away the most obvious bloodstains. Every movement was deliberate, a battle against time and the ever-present threat of discovery. She checked Shadow's wounds once more, whispering a promise that they would both make it out. Then she slipped the makeshift lead rope around the Mustang's neck, and together they eased into the underbrush, silent as ghosts. Moving through the drenched forest was slow and grueling. Madison kept low, choosing paths where the ground was firmer, leading Shadow along animal trails whenever possible. Every sound seemed amplified: the distant caw of a crow, the trickle of water, the crack of a twig that might have been her own foot, or something far more sinister. Her heart hammered each time she glanced back, convinced she would see the glint of metal or the cruel flash of a stranger's eyes. Shadow moved with increasing confidence, her survival instincts guiding her steps. Madison watched the horse with awe, drawing strength from the Mustang's resilience. They pushed through ferns and brambles, ducked beneath branches heavy with rain, and crossed patches of sunlight that seemed almost sacred after the endless night. But the danger never truly faded. Every so often, Madison would spot a cigarette butt half buried in the mud, or catch a whiff of tobacco smoke carried by the wind. Once, she heard men's voices, faint and distant, angry, frustrated, echoing off the trees. She pressed herself flat against the earth, holding Shadow close. Her breath caught in her throat until the voices drifted away. In those moments, she realized just how easily hope could give way to fear, and how razor-thin the line was between safety and disaster. Still, they kept moving. Madison's entire world narrowed to the Mustang's side, the rhythm of careful footfalls and the promise that if they just kept going, if they could stay hidden a little longer, they might reach the road, might find help, might finally escape the shadow that had hunted them since that first terrible morning. When dusk began to fall, painting the forest in blue and silver, Madison finally dared to rest. She found a small rise, sheltered by an outcrop of stone and tangled branches, and there she and Shadow stopped for a moment of precious quiet. The Mustang's breathing slowed, her body easing into a wary calm. Madison stroked the horse's neck, feeling the steady thrum of life, and allowed herself to hope that the worst might be over. But as darkness closed in, and the memory of boot prints lingered in the back of her mind, Madison knew the fight was not yet done. In the wilderness, danger could return at any moment. Still, with every step, every act of care, she and Shadow had carved a path forward, one built on trust, determination, and the stubborn refusal to give in. As night bled into the forest, darkness pressed in from all sides. Madison's senses sharpened. Every movement, every sound weighted with the knowledge that their window of safety was shrinking. She and Shadow moved carefully, picking their way between ferns and slick roots, the earth damp and unsteady beneath their feet. Each snap of a twig behind them set Madison's nerves on edge. She could feel the presence of their pursuers now, not just a suspicion, but an imminent threat closing in. A sharp call echoed through the woods, a man's shout, coarse and angry, soon followed by another voice, louder, barking commands. The men were closer than she'd feared. Flashlights bobbed in the distance, flickering between trunks, searching. The wild, which had shielded Madison and the Mustang for so long, suddenly felt as thin as gauze. She ducked low, urging Shadow behind a cluster of boulders, both of them holding still as the beams of light danced by, missing them by inches. Madison's mind raced. She had only one flare left, her final hope for distraction, and the makeshift slingshot she'd fashioned from a bent branch and strips of paracord. Stones, gathered in her jacket pocket, clinked with every nervous movement. She waited, heartbeat drumming in her ears, until the voices drew even closer. Boots thudded on wet leaves. She smelled the acrid tang of cigarettes and cheap liquor, heard the metallic rattle of guns. Shadow trembled, muscles quivering, but made no sound. Madison reached out, squeezing the Mustang's shoulder, silently willing her to stay calm. The air was thick with menace and fear. The men crashed through the brush, their forms growing sharper in the gloom. 3 of them, faces hard and hungry, rifles slung across their backs. They spread out, calling to one another, their search methodical. It was only a matter of time before they reached the hiding place. The lead man spotted movement, let out a yell, and charged forward, gun raised. In that split second, Madison acted. She yanked the flare from her pack and slammed it against a stone, igniting it in a burst of searing red light. With a quick prayer, she hurled it into the underbrush behind the men. The flare erupted in a blaze, sparks leaping into the wet ferns, bathing the trees in ghostly crimson. The men staggered back, momentarily blinded and disoriented, cursing and shouting as shadows twisted and leapt in the unnatural light. Seizing the moment, Madison rose to her knees and loaded a stone into her makeshift slingshot. She aimed for the largest, most threatening figure, releasing the stone with a sharp snap. It caught the man on the arm, making him howl and drop his weapon. She launched a second and third, driving the men back with a hail of rocks, their curses rising above the sudden crackle of burning brush. "Over here!" one of them yelled, but their voices were scattered, their discipline broken by the unexpected chaos. The forest itself seemed to join the fray, branches whipping, roots tripping, confusion turning every step into a risk. Madison wasted no time. She scrambled to her feet and tugged Shadow's lead rope, the Mustang stumbling but following, both of them crashing through the undergrowth. She didn't dare look back. The flare's light was fading, replaced by the darker threat of smoke and angry men regaining their bearings. They burst onto an animal trail, Madison's lungs burning, legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Shadow kept pace, spurred by the panic of pursuit. The shouts behind them grew fainter but more frantic, guns cracking as bullets chewed into tree trunks, splinters flying. Madison ducked, pulling the horse along, weaving left and right in hopes of losing their hunters. The world narrowed to the pounding of her heart and the ragged, desperate rhythm of escape. Branches clawed at her arms, mud sucked at her boots. She could taste blood in her mouth from a bitten tongue, the iron tang mixing with fear. She pushed harder, searching for any sign of the main road, any promise of rescue. The woods thinned, trees giving way to tangled undergrowth, and finally, miraculously, a narrow stretch of gravel. Headlights cut the dark ahead, a battered pickup rumbling toward them. Madison stumbled into the open, waving her arms, nearly collapsing with relief. Shadow followed, nostrils flared, body shuddering with every step. The pickup screeched to a halt. Its door flew open, and an older man stepped out, shotgun in hand, eyes wide with recognition and concern. He shouted something. Madison could barely hear him over the roar in her ears, but she saw the way he looked at Shadow, as if recognizing a long-lost friend. Behind them, the men broke from the trees, but the rancher leveled his shotgun, voice thunderous with warning. The pursuers stopped short, hesitation flickering across their faces. The standoff lasted only seconds before the men, seeing their advantage gone and the threat of the gun, faded back into the forest, swallowed by darkness and defeat. Madison collapsed against the truck, her whole body shaking, tears blurring her vision. Shadow leaned into her, the trembling of her flanks the only sign left of the terror they had fled. The danger had not vanished, not entirely, but for the first time hope felt real, tangible as the rough fabric of the rancher's coat, warm as the light spilling from the truck's cab. The long night was finally giving way. Survival had demanded everything, but in the bruised dawn, Madison and Shadow had found their way to the edge of safety. Dawn broke over the Montana wilderness in a wash of gold, the kind of light that made even scars seem softer. For Madison, slumped against the side of Hank's battered pickup, the world felt dreamlike and unreal, as if she and Shadow had crossed some invisible border between nightmare and peace. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind trembling limbs and the bone-deep exhaustion of survival, but in its place was an overwhelming, quiet relief. Hank, the rancher who had stopped to help, moved with the practiced calm of a man used to emergencies. He surveyed Madison's muddy, blood-stained clothes, her bruised face, and the wild, shivering Mustang at her side. There was no need for explanation. The scene told its own story. With the sun rising behind him, Hank gently ushered them into the warmth of his truck. Shadow balked at first, hooves skittering on gravel, but Madison's quiet touch and the rancher's steady hand soon coaxed her inside, where the battered horse collapsed in a heap of exhausted trust. The drive to Hank's ranch felt endless and fleeting at once. Madison stared out the window, watching as the endless pines and rolling fields slipped past. Every jolt of the road sent fresh aches through her body, but she welcomed them as proof she was still alive. Beside her, Shadow lay stretched out in the hay-filled bed, breathing deep, finally safe from the violence that had hunted her since the beginning. At the ranch, help moved quickly and without question. Hank's wife, Martha, brought blankets and clean water. Together, they washed Shadow's wounds, tending each cut and burn with gentle hands and quiet compassion. Madison assisted as best she could, her mind a blur of memories. The terror in the clearing, the bears, the storm, the desperate escape through the wild. All of it seemed distant now, as if washed away by the sound of running water and the soft, rhythmic comfort of the ranch's heartbeat. A veterinarian arrived, drawn by the urgency in Hank's voice. She examined Shadow with clinical efficiency, murmuring approval at Madison's makeshift bandages and the Mustang's fighting spirit. The wounds, though deep, would heal. The scars would remain, a testament to pain survived, but the worst was over. Shadow received painkillers, antibiotics, and fresh hay. Her head drooped with relief, her breathing finally even and slow. For Madison, rest did not come easily. She wandered the ranch, camera forgotten at her side, feeling the unfamiliar ache of safety. She watched as the morning sun spilled across the fields, catching the glint of dew on the backs of grazing horses. There was peace here, hard-won and precious, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe in it. News of Shadow's rescue spread quickly. Madison's photos and story, shared first with Hank and Martha, then with the wider world, struck a chord. Images of the battered Mustang, her regal head lifted in defiance, her black coat gleaming in the new day, found their way across the internet. People responded with outrage and with hope. Rescue groups rallied, news crews called, donations flowed for the care and protection of wild Mustangs. The cruelty Shadow had suffered was not erased, but it was brought into the light. The world, at least for a moment, took notice. Madison found herself at the center of a movement she had only dreamed of joining. She spoke to reporters, shared her story in trembling but determined words, and watched as Shadow became a symbol, not just of pain, but of the possibility of redemption and the power of compassion. The road to change was long, but it had begun with one act of courage in the wilderness, one decision to fight instead of walk away. Weeks passed. Shadow healed, her coat regaining its luster, her eyes growing clear and bright. She roamed Hank's pasture, sometimes alone and sometimes surrounded by other rescues. Madison visited daily, their bond deepened by every shared memory, every quiet moment in the fields. She documented Shadow's recovery in photographs and notes, each image a celebration of survival, each word a promise that the Mustang's suffering would have meaning. One afternoon, with the sun warm on her back and the scent of sage drifting on the wind, Madison saddled Shadow for the first time, not to claim her, but to honor her trust. The Mustang moved beneath her, strong and sure, her steps light on the open prairie. Together, they rode out beyond the fences, where wildflowers nodded in the breeze and the horizon seemed endless. Madison laughed, the sound rising and falling with the wind, and for the first time since that fateful morning in the forest, her spirit soared. As they returned, Madison knew this was only the beginning. Her photographs, her words, and her will to protect had already changed one life. And maybe in time, many more. The lesson was as clear as the sky above. In the face of cruelty, compassion is an act of defiance. To save even one life is to change the world. And so, as dusk painted the plains in gold and violet, Madison and Shadow rode side by side, a testament to survival, to new beginnings, and to the unbreakable bond between the wild and the free.